In just a moment, I'm going to give the floor to Kevin Sutcliffe, who will be moderating tonight's discussion. But before I do, I just want to introduce all of our panelists. So from the left, Kevin Sutcliffe is the Director of News Programming for Vice EU. Frederick Paxton is a filmmaker and photographer for Vice. He has worked in Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and other locations. He is one of the directors of The Road to Mosul. Professor Toby Dodge is director of the Middle East Center at LSE and the author of Iraq, From War to a New Authoritarianism. Anthony Lloyd is roving foreign correspondent for The Times and author of My War Gone By, I Miss It So, and Another Bloody Love Letter. And lastly, Patrick Coburn is a journalist on The Independent and a frequent contributor to the London Review of Books. He has written 3 books on Iraq, and his recent publication is The Rise of the Islamic State, ISIS and the New Sunni Uprising. He returned from a visit to Iraq and Syria just earlier this week. So over to Kevin.
Oh, thank you. So probably a bit of context. We've done 10 or 15 films over the last year in and around Syria and Iraq. We were quite interested in the supposed imminent fall or retaking of Mosul. A few months ago when it was being promoted as that was what was going to happen, that the Islamic State were going to be in retreat. There would be an amazing concerted effort from forces not quite clear. We're going to retake Mosul. So we had reasonably good relations with the Peshmerga and we decided to go along to see what was happening, maybe to do the first of several films in the inevitable retaking of Mosul, which should be happening about now. So we came back with a very different film, and I think a very complicated film, which raises quite a number of very interesting and troubling issues, which hopefully we can discuss now. It'd be nice to have some reaction to the film, and then maybe take that on in terms of what we all understand about both where the Islamic State is now in Iraq and Syria, and also what the response to the Islamic State is in reality. Just for a little bit more of context, yesterday Vice News interviewed Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, and he was not having any of it that IS seemed to be as strong as ever. He was pointing to the Iraqi Army taking to Crete as evidence that, in fact, the IS are being pushed back. Though he did rather wistfully ask for a more forceful Sunni opposition force in Iraq, which I took to mean that he'd like the Iraqi Army to be better than it is. But he didn't actually say that. But in the context of this film, what we tried to do was try and understand what was about to happen around Mosul and that front line, and also go in after the first wave of publicity and press about Sinjar to find out again what was happening there. So Freddie was the director camera, Aris Rousinos, the reporter, who isn't going to send a video message or any message at all, he's out of the country, were there for about a month. And that is a distillation, I think we've had a fair distillation of what they found. I was wondering with Patrick, what your first, or your impression, or what you got from watching the film.
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations all concerned. I think it's a terrific film, and I think it's good because it focuses on the same place and the same people. If you get a documentary which jumps from a scene outside Mosul to something outside Fallujah to an interview with the Iraqi Prime Minister to somebody from a think tank in Washington and back again, it sort of looks nice, but if you actually know the scene, you know it doesn't actually tell you things. This does tell you things, but you need to focus in one place. If you're a reporter, you need, to stay in one place to find out what's happening. 20 minutes isn't good enough for a reporter. A brief sort of 2-minute segment of in a documentary, and then you shift to somewhere else. As I said, it's often, it's interesting because you have a new scene, but it's often very deceptive what's actually happening. One thing, I was in with Peshmerga in that area earlier this year. I was just in across the border in Syria, where the Syrian Kurds are fighting quite hard. One thing that does come across to me is how tough the Islamic State is. It's not just a bunch of crazy, depraved gunmen as we saw here, unfortunately. I was talking in particular, obviously I can't go into the Islamic State without having my head chopped off. But talking to people who've just left from there, and one of the reasons they're leaving is that their children, families are trying to leave, it's not easy to do, is their children have been conscripted as fighters into IS forces. Very difficult to avoid conscription, much more difficult than the Syrian army or the Iraqi army. This means they're raising a lot of troops. These are very serious guys. And what you say about Philip Hammond is because there's this extraordinary sort of wish fulfillment, or wishful thinking is what I mean to say, on the part of Western governments, of the Baghdad government. Last year, it was pretty obvious early on in the year, and I read a book about this, that ISIS, or Daesh, what everybody calls it in the area, could freely operate in an area almost from the Mediterranean, certainly from to the Iranian frontier. Not much attention given to it. They take Mosul, they have a lot of victories, and then you have the same thing, this wish fulfillment. They've taken to Crete. The Iraqi army after about a month, but Daesh didn't really fight for it. There are probably a few hundred snipers in there. Instead, they attacked Ramadi. So I think there's wishful thinking on the part of Hammond and the others. I don't think they really believe this. I have a nasty feeling they do believe this rubbish. But it is one of the great strengths of the Islamic State, is that they are facing people like Philip Hammond on the other side.
Anthony, what strikes me in the film is that sort of quite old-fashioned stalemate you get from it. The sort of the trench warfare, the sort of the two sides are just stuck there.
I thought it was a fun film. I enjoyed it. I say fun in the best possible way. I think Aris is great. So you look at Aris, you're like presenting. You want to be in his gang. He's up for it. He'll go for it. But he's always looking a bit worldly worn and like, oh God, it's foggy. There's no airstrikes. Maybe it's going to go wrong. Which I thought was very. I thought the presentation was very charming. You can see that ISIS would go through the Peshmerga there like a knife through butter strikes. Insport them. We used to call them 10, 15 years ago the peach melba because they used to melt so easily in the sun there. Decent guys, they're under-equipped. You can see a lot of them are very old. And having seen the other side of it, which was Syria in the early stages of the revolution through to the formation of ISIS, and having seen ISIS directly in action and in Aleppo and all the rest of it, they're cut from a very different cloth. They know how to fight. And the key line one of them said is it's very difficult to fight people who aren't afraid to give away their life. I mean, one of the whole great tenets of warfare is that you fight people, you kill some of them, you wound others, and then at some point someone decides that actually I want to keep my life and go. And ISIS don't operate by those rules. The last thing I'd say was the film was a lot about time. It was a stalemate. Picking up what Patrick said about Philip Hammond, there is an acceptance in the West that this is going to go on for a very long time, that somehow it's an Iraqi and a Syrian problem and we can perhaps box it in and it's going to go on for ages, and that may or may not matter if we can protect, in this case, Britain's soils from terrorist attack. But time isn't neutral when it comes to ISIS. The longer they are there, the more kids they take and train up, and the more extreme they get, and the more they prepare for attacks against the West. So a lot of the film is about the question of time.
Toby, you can't be surprised by that film and what you saw.
No, but I thought it brought over very well almost the moral ambiguity of the battlefield, that basically you had, as was pointed out very pointedly, Arab villages who, as the kind of ISIS advance swept over them, quick choice to make, which is whether to offer temporary allegiance to ISIS and not be slaughtered, or to flee. And of course then the Kurdish villages didn't have that choice. So I think, and then once the Peshmerga fought back, the choice was reversed and a great deal of Iraqi Arabs disappeared. Now that, of course, is the nature of warfare possibly anywhere, especially where ethnic and religious dynamics are concerned, but it means there's great pools of resentment and fear ahead of any battle, ahead of any front line. And if we look at the driving force behind ISIS, I think it's better to look at ISIS as a military terrorist organizational symptom of a set of deeper causes, the failure basically of the Iraqi state and then the failure of the Syrian state and its slip into civil war that's created these deep pools of insecurity and resentment, which has then driven its recruitment. Just to add to the general tone of skepticism and cynicism about the coalition. I flew in from Washington yesterday morning, and clearly it is now, I'm happy to report, dawning on the US government that their policy isn't working, that air power and proxies, and as was being said, a set of very poorly trained and armed proxies isn't going to win. But there's a deep commitment that there's not going to be much else either. So the stalemate that you see backed up by air power is status quo that the United States can live with. And of course the aftermath of the retaking of Tikrit led to a series of atrocities that then exacerbated that spiral of. So I don't see this going away anytime soon, but I also don't see the escalation of international commitment that would be implicit in what we see as ISIS has advanced.
So we're looking at more of the same from the last 3 years, effectively.
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say, and we see this, I think, with the Islamic State's push on Erbil in the summer. I think that when operating in Kurdish or Shia majority areas, they haven't got a hope, but the ambiguity of both the Kurdish regional government's treatment of its minority Sunni Arab population, and much, much worse, the long-term, since 2003, bias of the Iraqi government against its Sunni population has fertilized the soil into which the Sunni revolt that Patrick talks about sprang.
I mean, not to mention another film we made, we've just done a film about the Army of Conquest and the Nusra-dominated front that's been going through Idlib at the moment, which has been, in a way, lauded as another way of pushing IS and the regime back. But I wonder whether you've got any view on that, because that's another grouping that seems to be
I think it's
pragmatic.
Fantastically dangerous self-deception. First of all, there's kind of rebranding of the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate, was created in 2012 by Daesh, by Islamic State as their Syrian branch. Then they sort of tried to resume control of them. There was a split. They fight each other. But actually, Islamic State fights everybody. I don't think these guys will stand up to Islamic State. I think this sort of idea being pushed by the Turks and the Saudis that somehow these are the opposition to Islamic State is incredibly self-defeating. And if you're in Damascus and you're a Sunni in the army, or you're an Alawite, or you're a Christian, you're pretty sure these guys are going to cut your head off just as soon as Islamic State is. I mean, I was in Qamishli, which is the sort of capital of the Syrian Kurdish bit of Syria, and actually the Syrian Kurds fight real hard. I mean, they're different from the Peshmerga here, and actually they have the same celebration of martyrdom in a secular sense that Islamic State does. I mean, they are prepared to get killed. There are pictures of martyrs everywhere. There are enormously elaborate funerals, but leaving that aside. But I was asking one of the Syrian Kurdish leaders, what's the difference between Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra? And he said, well, there isn't any. They're both the children of al-Qaeda. And in fact, the Islamic State forces they were fighting near where I was had been Jabhat al-Nusra a little time back. So I think this attempt to say Jabhat al-Nusra over here, the kinder, gentler jihadis, and Islamic State over here, is willful self-deception.
I'm not so sure. I must admit, having had the misfortune to be abducted in Syria, there was one point during the abduction where we thought that Jabhat might have us instead of ISIS, and it was like, oh, at least it's Jabhat. I think Jabhat al-Nusra probably are a different cloth. I mean, certainly if I'd been playing games in Syria, I think I would have handled Jabhat al-Nusra a lot differently, having spent a lot of time with our fighters. Most of the ones I met, not all, most of them were homegrown Syrians. They had a nationalist perspective and that they wanted out from Assad. But many of them, and even the lads from Brighton, sort of you put to them like, well, you want to go home and blow us all up there. They didn't. Now, that's not to say that they're all like that. The Khorasan group is a bit more questionable. I think what you are seeing now, which is the greater question beyond Mosul, or more immediate, is the survival of the Assad regime. It looks, we can't be too preemptive on this, we said it before, it looks, looking at all the trend lines, it looks like Assad's probably going to go down at some point, which we weren't thinking a year ago, having thought it 2 years ago. A year ago he was looking bolstered by Hezbollah and Iran, and now it's looking like, God, he's lost some really key territory. The Turks and the Qataris are very cohesive in their supplies to the Islamic Front and Jabhat. There's some really big battlefield reverses. What does it mean? How eventually is this going to play out between ISIS and Jabhat? Are we being deceptive? Are ISIS going to wipe Jabhat out? And if they don't, what does Jabhat mean to the region, and what does it mean to the West? And those are unanswered questions. I wouldn't say Jabhat and ISIS are the same myself, but it's a big question as to how that's going to shake out.
Just one point, and it's because Islamic State puts up front its sort of foreign fighters, and because the suicide bombers are all for foreigners, there's an impression that it's all foreign, but actually it's probably 70–80% Iraqi and Syrian. Foreign fighters, somebody arrives from Birmingham here, they are Muslim, but they have no military experience and they don't speak Arabic. They're going to end up either as a suicide bomber pretty fast, or they seem to be in chunks of where they're used as cannon. And all over the Islamic State, they're raising more troops everywhere.
So, Toby,
as I mentioned.
You mentioned you've had some sort of insight into the strategic thinking, such as it is. I mean, it seems quite rickety from our coverage. You know, you've got a hope that Iran, or in some way some Iran-backed Shia militia, are going to try and do something over here. You've got some strange support for Nusra over here. It seems that there isn't really a strategy, and to your point, that the sort of West seems to be prepared to just watch this thing implode across two countries. It doesn't really quite know what to do.
It depends who we mean by the West. I mean, we can all laugh at Philip Hammond, it's quite easy, but if you go to Washington, you find a president who gained the Democratic nomination, and because he wasn't Hillary Clinton, and won the election because he wasn't George Bush, and sees his legacy in the region centrally as the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah.
If you in the leaked letters that he sent to Khamenei, the supreme leader, and if you talk off the record to senior administration people, you find, I think, a fairly idealistic and one would say naive understanding of Iran's role in the region. And I think there's a sense that because the United States and Iran share a fellow enemy in ISIS, that somehow they can work together. Now, my point frequently made to the US administration is, if you look at the source of the problem in Iraq, and keeping in mind ISIS, Iraqi group born out of the fires of the Iraqi civil war in 2006 and driven forward by the failures, first and foremost, of the United States and the Iraqi government, but also Iranian policy in Iraq, the kind of Shia majoritarian triumphalism that gave the Sunni population nowhere to go but into the arms of violence, and after the election of 2010 back into the arms of violence. So I think I smiled when you said strategic thinking in the US, because it's probably not thinking, and it's certainly not strategic. It's a deep commitment to limitation. So as far as the Obama administration was concerned, last August they faced the perfect storm in the seizure of Sinjar that they couldn't walk away from, but they've been dragged kicking and screaming into what is a fairly slow escalation. And now they've reached a peak where they've got a lot of special forces on the ground and air power, but the argument is about whether you forward position those special forces to call in airstrikes, and that argument, I think, has been won by a caution, not by escalation.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I can't see. We have an American president, or we have an American president who is avowedly and determinedly non-interventionist. And there is a price for non-interventionism, just the same as there is a price for interventionism.
So
Yeah, but just to go on from that, I think that's true, but it's also the interventionism which was proposed by Republicans, by opponents of Obama, naive and think you can do things that you can't. They kind of want to have it both ways, that somehow you can intervene against Islamic State, but it's all going to be, you don't need that number of troops, you can do a few small things and it'll have a big impact. It won't be like that. If you intervene, you have to intervene pretty massively. I mean, lots of things could happen. You know, you look at the front line on the film, true, and it looks a bit like the Western Front, but the whole front line in Iraq between the Kurds and Islamic State is 1,000 kilometers long. And this compared, the Western Front in 1914 was 750 kilometers long. This is a lot bigger. So it's really a series of strong points. You can punch through at various points.
Just to pick up on Patrick's point, the news cycle has a function, and to a certain extent the function, and a film like this, but a short news at 10, bang, 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 black and white, problem, do something. And so as the Syrian civil war escalated and the undoubted crimes against humanity of the Assad regime is bad, the opposition to the Assad regime is good, back the opposition. Now, to a certain extent, you could blame the Obama administration, and there's a big argument on the Republican side, if they had intervened then, if they had used air power, if there had been a no-fly zone. That's a series of ifs, and of course the news cycle turns. The Islamic State in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, aren't on the side of the angels. They're both radical Islamists. And now the news cycle is turning again to some extent. Oh, no, Jabhat al-Nusra aren't that bad. And, of course, you can't capture, even in a 1,000-word news piece, which is ludicrously long, the complexities just laid out, that some of Jabhat al-Nusra are better. Jabhat al-Nusra are much popular on the battlefield in Syria because they're seen as an indigenous Syrian force, and they're seen as more aware of the nuances of the population that they've got control over. I think the US use of air power, especially in the Kurdish regions, does seem to be helping, but if anything, it's stalled ISIS advance. It hasn't stopped it. And of course, ISIS is an incredibly well-organized, very mobile force. If you think what happened from the beginning of the American-led surge in February 2007 to the end of 2011 when American troops were withdrawn, the United States military threw everything it had to the detriment of their campaign in Afghanistan against what was then Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. It drove its numbers down to the low hundreds in 2011 in Iraq. From the low hundreds, we have the force now that is rampaging through Iraq and Syria. My larger point is to do something is a humanitarian cry for help, which I can understand, but the something is not military. What the United States learned, and I think Obama is keenly aware of, that in 2003, the United States' world-dominant army was used in Iraq to try and solve a political problem, which it abjectly failed to do. We have now 2 civil wars in Syria and Iraq, and there isn't a military solution to that ultimately.
So yeah, you said, but I think exactly right. That these are genuine civil wars in Iraq and Syria. You genuinely have lots of people on both sides who are terrified of the other side. So if one will fight rather than let them in because they think they'll die. So will Assad go down? I don't think so, actually. I think people go vary. 2011, 12, he's meant to be going down. Doesn't go down, then he's meant to be up. There's a certain, now he's down again. I think one can sort of get the impression it'll go all the way. There are areas which will fight to the death against Assad. There are with Assad will fight to death against the other side. So I think that you will have this balance continuing, also because you've got outside backers who aren't going to throw in their hand. So I think that's going to continue. What should be done? Both Islamic State, Jabhat al-Nusra, Assad, they all depend rather on the militarization of the situation. In some ways, if the Americans bombed Islamic State in all places, including when they're fighting the Syrian army, then a lot of people in Damascus would think actually the Americans are better protection against Islamic State and jihadis than Assad is. At the moment, lots of people in Damascus, including lots of Sunni, think we don't much like Assad, but if he goes, this other lot will come in, and I may lose my head, I'll certainly become a refugee. The slogan of, which people believe there, of opposition slogan, or meant to be, of Alawites to the cemetery, Christians to Beirut. Actually, the Christians think they'll be killed too. So, you do have this sort of balance at the moment, this horrible stalemate. But the one factor in this, which I'm not sure, I don't know if I disagree or agree with others, is that Islamic State, to my mind, being right round the margins of it recently, is definitely growing stronger.
Freddie, you see, the thing that comes out most strongly to me is the way that Islamic State has co-opted some of the Sunni population, and therefore you're coming across the villages that have been decimated, and then the legacy that that's going to leave in terms of how people are going to try and construct lives together again. And what was your sense from going to those villages? You know, is there any sense that any groups will live together again in any form of harmony or even understanding?
I mean, as was said in the film with the Yazidi commander we met, you know, there initially is obviously a huge amount of anger towards different groups and the conflict that's been caused and the lives that have been lost. But I think you see with the more regular civilians, the Arab refugees we interviewed, it's the case in a lot of war zones. They just want the fighting to stop. You know, they are happy to be safe for the moment with the Kurds. They don't have any running water, they don't have any facilities, but the thing they desire the most is for there not to be, you know, conflict in that region. And I wanted to pick up on something with the Nusra angle, and also the way in which this changes in the news cycle. When we made a film in Aleppo last year, you know, Nusra were working in coalition with Al-Tawhid and Al-Tawhid is seen as a much more Islamist group. And the thing that's interesting is how that changes in the media, you know, and we're able to return to these areas and these things change. But on the ground, you know, I think it's very difficult for us to sit in London and have a fair perspective on that. So
I'm going to ask one more question of each of the panel, and then I'm going to throw it open to questions. So it's a bit of future gazing, I'm afraid. So Patrick, what does Syria look like 6 months from now? And Iraq,
well,
sorry.
I think a bit like now. I don't think Assad is going to go down, as I said, because there are too many forces on the other side. I think the war continues, but I think Islamic State is an increasingly strong position there. I think lots of wishful thinking in the West about what's going to happen. In Iraq, government, and the crucial thing since Mosul fell is the Iraqi Army hasn't come back together again. Before Ramadi, they had maybe 10 to 12,000 troops who will really fight. Now maybe it's down to half that. So again, Islamic State getting stronger. Where will they attack? I think they'll attack towards Kirkuk if they do attack, because that's got a large Arab population. Where will they attack in Syria? I think they'll attack towards Aleppo. Maybe not immediately, but I think they'll go for Aleppo.
So Anthony, do you think you'll be giving a world-weary look from the heights above Sinjar in 6 months' time? Same
Changed by then. Assad's going to be warming his toes in a dacha outside Moscow, and talks to that end are already ongoing. He'll be replaced by a new-faced regime who will dilute the strategy times there, the Syrian regime actually firing airstrike or launching airstrikes in support of the Daesh around Aleppo, who will be driven back somewhat towards Raqqa, well, more or less in the same position on all the front lines. And the big question will be, can Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic Front keep the Daesh away from the areas they've gained at the expense of the regime?
Go around the other side, go into Iraq and come up through Anbar. What does that look like?
Much the same. The Iraqi government might have managed to block off the ISIS on the road outside Ramadi, but I can't see a huge change in territory there at all.
Okay. Toby?
I think on Iraq, the battlefield is stable, in as much as Daesh is very good at exploiting Sunni majority areas, but very poor at moving out of them. I can briefly make runs on Erbil or make runs towards Baghdad. I think what Daesh will do with that solidification is raise the tempo of suicide bombings, IEDs in Baghdad. I think to pick up on the point that Patrick made, the Iraqi Army and security forces are pitifully weak. And what's taken their place are supersized militias. If you think of 2008 as the watershed of a decline in militia dominance, 2014 has brought that roaring back, and that can only, I suspect, lead to much more religious cleansing of areas that Daesh doesn't control, which then pushes those populations either into Daesh areas or into the Kurdish regional government. The Kurdish regional government roughly, I think, expanded the territory it controls by about 40% last year, and they've taken over populations that they have no capacity to control, and in fact, no great experience of controlling ethnically and religiously diverse populations. So if anything, I think the KRG is in for a problem. I think you're both right, if I can be horribly compromising, in the sense that the Syrian battlefield is much more fluid. And I think there's more interesting things. I think more interesting things happening. I think there would be a danger of overstating the rapprochement between the competing backers of the Islamic opposition. Turkey and Qatar, Syria. Turkey, I think that's a temporary rapprochement, if anything. So you have that competitive fracturing funding of the opposition. And I think you're quite careful. So Assad, I don't think Assad will go, but I think even if he did, you're not saying that the regime's going to fall. You say, so Assad...
No, the regime won't fall.
Yeah. So in that sense, I doubt that Assad will go, but because he polices his own internal ruling elite as carefully as he polices the rest of Syrian population. So a kind of gruesome stalemate between the Syrian regime and its oppositions, but its oppositions are so fractured. I think that's, and when I was listening to both of you, the issue that came up with the fall of Najibullah in Afghanistan, you have a highly fractured, very well armed, radicalized opposition. So if Damascus does fall, God help the Syrian population again, as it were.
Freddie.
Well, going back to the title of the film, The Road to Mosul, I'm not much in the business of future gazing, but my experience with the Peshmerga is a force that is not overly keen to move forward from these positions. As was just mentioned, they're stretched at their limits. It's 1,000 kilometers along that whole front line, and you see in the end. And I think the example is the guy who is defusing the IEDs. Now, bravery will get you so far, and it's good that he's able to to defuse as many as he has and save those lives, but you need more than bravery to make a push, and they are not massively keen to push. So I don't think they're in any rush to make any fast movements forward into more territory that they're not sure that they can control.
Great. Well, thank you for those comments. Throw it over to the floor if you've got any questions about the film or in general about the issues that we've been talking about.
We'll start in the front and move our way back, I think.
Thank you for the interesting commentary and the film, which was quite compelling. I'm Hadani Ditmars. I wrote a book on Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone. So one of the points in the film that I felt was the most poignant was the one with the Arab villagers who were just kind of trapped in this terrible situation. So I have two questions. One was, there were all these news reports about the sexy women Peshmerga fighters, but I didn't see any in your film, so I'm just wondering to what extent there are women fighters. My other question is, I'm currently working to start a kind of media empowerment NGO for some young Iraqi journalists who are disabled and also across sectarian lines. They're in Saladin province, and like a lot of Iraqi young people, they're caught between ISIS and the Shia militias. So, does the Iraqi army actually exist, or is it just a series of Shia militias? And why do you think there's so little news coverage in the West about, the brutality of ISIS, notwithstanding the brutality of the Shia militias who go in and liberate, quote unquote, these Sunni areas from ISIS and rape and pillage and murder, etc. And what's the hope for getting out of that terrible stalemate?
Shall we? I think we'll share those out. I think.
No, I was talking to. I mean, there are women fighters, but they're in the YPJ, which is in Syria, northeast, so the Kurdish areas of Syria.
Not in Iraq.
And well, they are fighting in Iraq, but around Sinjar, and they're really part of the PKK. At this point, one gets involved in an alphabet soup, but basically they're controlled by the PKK, the Kurdistan. Sorry, I'm forgetting my. Anyway, I mean the Turkish Kurdish movement, and they fight in women-only units, and pretty effectively. I was talking to them in sort of the western part of the Syrian Kurdish enclave there. And there are lots of them too. The thing on the Shia militias, actually it's not, you can't say they're equal to Daesh. Daesh sort of, there's one tribe, I was talking to the leader of the Abu Nimr tribe in Iraq. 864 members have been massacred by Daesh. Nobody else is killing people on that scale. There's another point about ISIS, which is quite intentionally they generate this sectarian friction, and with a motive. I mean, it's horrible, these bombs that they let off in Shia marketplaces, and been doing so since 2003 to kill a lot of people. But they know the consequences. They provoke the Shia, they attack and go and murder a lot of Sunni, and therefore the Sunni have nowhere to go but to the best fighters in that community, which happen to be the Islamic State in this case. So it has a sort of demonic policy behind these massacres that they carry out. In the disputed areas where we saw these villages, the thing is that all communities in Iraq and I think in Syria are now so terrified of each other, and they all believe instantly they've been betrayed by the other side. But you're a Sunni villager there, ISIS arrives, what do? I mean, you wave, you be real nice to these guys. Then if the other side move in, the Peshmerga move, what do? If you flee with ISIS, you're a member of ISIS. If you don't, you're waiting there as sleeper cells. Everyone talks about these ridiculous sleeper cells, waiting to stab the Peshmerga in the back. And such is the level of paranoia, they're in a completely impossible position.
But that doesn't mean there's a moral ambiguity, and I really take exception to your use of that word on the battlefield. Sure, bad things happen in war. You can still be, to some extent, a Sunni community who lives in a government-controlled area, of which there are very, very many in Baghdad areas or whatever, but you cannot be a Shia community who's left in an isolated position in the ISIS area, because they will kill you. So it's not black and white. Of course there have been war crimes on all, but there's been nothing like the deliberate scale of massacre on either of the other two sides in the three-way war, if you divide it that way, compared to ISIS. I mean, there just hasn't, and to call it a moral ambiguity is just not a fair description of what's going on there at all in Iraq. That said, I can't see the communities who have been strained so much over the last 10, 12 years getting back together again. One interesting thing which didn't come out in this film, I thought, was the Yazidis' attitude towards the Kurds. The Yazidis were very frightened of ISIS and had suffered grievously, but they're also pretty angry with the Peshmerga, who they thought had cut and run them to their fate, and has left a lot of residual anger there.
Yeah,
but,
exactly. I mean, a lot of these communities and villages were saying to me, if the Peshmerga had given us 3 hours warning, we could have got our families out. They didn't.
That have been abandoned by the Iraqi Army to ISIS as well.
The last thing I wanted to say is that Shia militia is such an umbrella term. It means everything. I mean, I've spent time with Shia militias who were quite skilled fighters, were under very strict orders to not abuse Sunni communities, were under strict orders to bury dead Islamic State fighters. And I've been with Shia militias who were under none of those orders and would quite happily, idea of a good time was killing Sunni prisoners. So, I mean, there's scores of Shia militias. There's 2 or 3 principal ones, but there's scores, and they've each got different command structures and answer to different people. Some to Sistani, some to the Iranians, some to the Baghdad government. There's a militia for all seasons there.
So is there an Iraqi army, I guess?
I'll restate the 2 words moral ambiguity, because ISIS is so demonic, as Patrick said, because it's so beyond the pale. The reflection seen in a short news cycle is to see the opposition as somewhat on the side of the angels when it clearly isn't. Now, you quite rightly say that there's been very little news coverage on the atrocities that certain Shia militias have committed, but there has been some, and there was a big, very detailed report by ABC TV in the US looking at the social media that certain Shia militias have used that clearly shows that they've committed horrific crimes, from beheading torture from immolation right through. Now, yes, there is an ambiguity around. I was talking to I accused a very senior US military figure of becoming what David Petraeus worried that they would, the Air Force for the Shia militia. He said, no. We can split the Shia militias into good and bad militias. And I was somewhat skeptical about this. But what he meant, actually, was the popular mobilization forces that ran to the front on Sistani's orders that Hyderabad has spent a lot of time trying to gain control over. But we call them militias closely because they're informally created, speedily created. They don't have the command and control that that military forces should have. And so clearly, atrocities, illegality, brutality is much more widespread amongst them, albeit with some variation. So I think there is a moral ambiguity, and the moral ambiguity is, yes, Daesh is so horrific and so beyond, so easily to criticize, but we need then to turn the gaze around and see what the other side's doing. On the Iraqi Army, keep in mind before January 2014, it had nearly 1 million, or the Iraqi Armed Forces had nearly 1 million men under arms, twice the size in the Ministry of Interior to the Ministry of Defense, which kind of indicates what they were being used primarily for, which is population control. The Iraqi Army has indeed collapsed, Patrick's right, but its collapse started with the beginning of the Daesh offensive, which was the taking of Fallujah in December 2013 into 14. And when you look at the population, the popular mobilization, the militias, people would say, well, what else can we do? The Daesh seemed to be on a roll straight through to Baghdad. We had to throw at it what we could. And I think that's right. What worries me profoundly is that security vacuum isn't going away. That the Americans are again, with no sense of history or irony, saying, oh, no, but we put these numbers of low thousands through our retraining campaigns. Doesn't that sound a bit like 2004? Now, Hyderabad is talking about the creation of a National Guard, the decentralization of both the military and political powers of the provinces. I agree with that. I think that's a very astute messaging to the Sunni majority populations of the Northwest, saying, no, you can run your own lives. We've screwed it up since 2003. But the danger of decentralizing a state that's in the process of collapsing is that you accelerate that process of collapse.
Hello, just a kind of general question to the panel. There are rumors in the region that ISIS, sort of conspiracy theories, that ISIS is, if not a Western puppet, certainly kind of quite strategically useful to the West in the sense that it keeps the region weak. And this might sound crazy to some people, but a lot of people do believe this in the region. To what extent do you think that this has any weight at all? For example, do you think that if given sufficient appetite, the so-called West would be able to launch an effective military intervention? Or do you think that there is simply not sufficient appetite to do so? Or do you think that really there isn't the manpower, the strength, the strategic intelligence, whatever, basically?
So, Patrick, the Americans are playing a clever game.
Yeah, it's always, this is very sort of Middle Eastern, of sort of the great conspiracies, yes. And it's almost conventional wisdom. People regard you, give you strange looks if you suggest ISIS is not run from Washington. It's garbage, you know. Then in Syria, then you have other people who believe it's all the creation of Assad, you know. Now, of course, at various points, people do take advantage of, of opportunities that if the opposition, part of the opposition is dominated by ISIS, that's to some extent the political advantage of Assad. It doesn't necessarily mean he created it, although at various moments he may have been quite happy that the opposition was dominated that way. So I think that what's depressing about these conspiracy theories, you then find, it's not only that crazy, but people don't actually have any realistic ideas about what they should do to end this terrible conflict, because their mind are full of conspiracies of people who secretly are supporting their enemies and so forth. So there's very little constructive thought at any level. And you find people who sort of these conspiracy theories who actually think what realistically they might do to end this.
Yeah, so Toby, it is actually all a strategy after all.
I was sitting in Baghdad in 2003 as the city was being taken apart. Violence was escalating. I was sitting in a fairly senior ex-government official's diwan, and he was saying, see, couldn't stand Baathists as the lions of the Middle East. I say two things. Firstly, you're probably 10, 15 years out of date, and please, you do your enemy such great injustice by thinking they're smarter than they are. I mean, part of my work born out of the debacle of 2003 is to spend the next 11 years studying American foreign policy in application, and trust me, it's worse than even you think. Now, this brings a much larger point, and it brings a point around what I was talking about was the justified humanitarian instinct. Absolute horror is being unleashed by Daesh, being unleashed through barrel bombs by Damascus, has been unleashed on sides of the battlefield. Surely we, whoever we make, should be something to do with that. Now, if I look at the Iraq situation, a country that I've sadly studied my whole life and studied it getting worse, it strikes me that violence, Daesh itself, is simply a symptom of much wider political failure. So sending in the airborne or the 4th Infantry Division temporarily stopped the violence as the invasion in 2003 removed a egregiously horrible dictatorship. But look at the absolute horror that invasion unleashed, a horror that clearly the United States has got no answer to. So military power is very good at killing people, and it can kill people who've killed more people. But what it can't do is rebuild states. And if we look at the decade of intervention from 1991 onwards, and we look at where were successful interventions, are very few in number. And if you actually look at the statistics of interventions, statistically they don't seem to work. And where they have worked, in the very few occasions, it's where there's been solid state structures, institutional structures that remain in society, and what you're doing is taking them and reforming. That clearly now isn't the case in Iraq. And probably never was from the 90s onwards, and it clearly now isn't the case in Syria as the civil war unfolded and shredded the state. So anyone who calls for intervention to stop the horror is exercising, I think, an understandable humanitarian instinct. Ask them what happens after you've killed the bad guys, and I think you come up with a shuffling of feet and a wringing of hands.
There was I just want to step in there and say, I think there was a point, perhaps in Syria, where the threat of a military action or some sort of military action might have produced, a best case scenario, which was not the victory of either side, but some sort of negotiated settlement. Unfortunately, I think that point is that boat sailed so long ago. And I think we do look now at the horrific violence of the Daesh and everyone else, but often fail or neglect to notice the impact of our own intervention in Iraq and our own violence, which is what most of this stems from, not all of it.
No, I mean, as a student of Middle East politics, I would certainly not say that I am pro-intervention. I think that people misunderstood that. What I really meant was, why isn't there, I mean, maybe there is, but it doesn't seem to be any kind of diplomatic effort or any type of behind-the-scenes work, maybe there is, to try and find a different solution.
Toby.
You were saying about the negotiations to remove Assad to Dacha in Russia.
2 years ago, I think the threats could have been used in a more constructive way, but I think it is in free fall. I think it's very difficult.
But you were alluding to possible diplomatic moves to remove him now. No.
No. I think personally, I think there's some pretty heavy talks going on between him and the Russians for someone else. But you know.
The reason there is such a militant deadlock in the Security Council is about the rise of Putin, undoubtedly, and a move, but it's also about Resolution 1973 and the Libya and regime change in Libya. The Russians, for better or worse, sincerely believed they were lied to over Libya. That they backed a resolution that was clearly putting a limit on the use of force to protect Libyan population, and it then accelerated to remove the regime. And they drew a line and said not one step further. And to some extent, and their strategic allies and interests and everything beyond that, that is why they are so committed to defending what they would have seen as the status quo or a negotiated outcome of a civil war, not intervention.
Got probably a chance for two more questions before we have to repair to the bar.
I think everybody knows how dreadful the Islamic State is, and I was wondering, why do you think people from the West, especially women, actually go to Syria to join it? And from the film, like the Yazidi man said, how can we live with them after they've slaughtered us? So if ISIS is got rid of, which isn't going to happen anytime soon, how are the communities in Iraq going to live together after?
Freddie?
Well, I think even before this current conflict started, this rehashing, it was a very complex web of ethnic groups in that region, and you see the look in these people's faces when you speak to this guy and he's lost his sons, his brother's lost his sons. I don't see that repairing anytime soon, even after a long battle with ISIS.
Yeah, I mean, how are the communities going to live together afterwards? It's very simple, they aren't. A lot of things we're talking about, it's too late. People hate and fear each other too much. Look, in Belfast, you still have peace walls between Catholics and Protestants, because never anything like as bad as Syria or Iraq, but people are still frightened of each other. There, I've had Sunni and Shia working for me in Baghdad, very nice people, secular people, both coming to me separately and saying, look, I've nothing against the other person, but tell them nothing about me. Don't tell them where I live, don't tell them anything else. People are petrified of each other. And there's a history to this, we're looking at the Peshmerga, but after the fall of Mosul, Kurds, the KRG, thought great opportunity, will take over the areas that we've disputed with the Arabs. So they moved into the disputed areas. This was much resented by the local Arabs. There's a town outside called Karakosh outside Mosul. I was talking to people from. After the fall of Mosul, the Peshmerga move in, they surround this Christian town, they're Syrian Christians, with a new trench. They won't let Arab villagers in. So Arab women who used to use the local hospital end up by giving birth in the trench around this town. That's when ISIS arrives, of course, the local Arabs greet them because they got real angry in quite a short space of time. So anyway, basically these things are pretty well, to my mind, impossible to reverse. It's all too late.
Toby?
Sadly, I don't do that, but let me just put my academic hat on and say it's easy to extrapolate from that this ancient hatreds hypothesis. I'm not saying anyone on the platform is doing that, saying, oh, they always hated each other. This is the kind of what I've called in other stuff I've written, the Sykes-Picot delusion, that it's the Europeans who brought these states, imposed them, which is true actually, imposed them on the region, and then they're now dying. This is the final death of imperial hubris and fallacy. Now, if you look at much more closely, firstly, it wasn't the Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided up the region, but that's a kind of nerdish point. The issue is that these states functioned, and national communities within them gained the primary allegiance of the majority of the population for periods of time. Out of the failure of regime change, and the abject, sclerotic, corrupt barbarity of the Assad regime in Syria, ethnic and religious identities were reinvented and driven forward as a solution to lawlessness. Now, that's not to say that once this civil war has unfolded, as Patrick was saying with reference to Belfast, that genie can be put back in a bottle within a generation or two, but it is to stress that this wasn't the default position of the Middle East under the Ottoman Empire, and at times from 1920 through possibly to the 80s or the 90s, that populations have traded their sub-state identities, religious or ethnic, for national identities, state identities, and may one day again do so.
And as for why people want to join, because ISIS are so badass. They're delightful to huge tranches of our society here. They would laugh at us. A largely white middle-class audience, baffled by white people with a history of Bosnia, Chechnya, Palestine, invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, might be pissed off at the way the Sunni people have been treated for so long. When we hear about young men and women being radicalized online, very seldom is it a skilled theological discussion. More often than not, they're just looking at what Assad's been doing, what's been going on in Iraq. And it leaves a bed of a sentiment of anger, combined often, not always, with a fairly classic stereotype. You know, don't get on well with mum and dad, feel slightly confused by the foundations of your Muslim faith here in Britain, perhaps a bit of trouble with the police, minor criminal conviction, perhaps not. And then suddenly, perhaps some meaningless in your life, or quite a lot of anger often, then, hey, go over and serve under the Black Shahada in Syria. You are given meaning, you're given an identity, you're given a lot of absolution by the religious terms of it all. You can be part of a brotherhood that means something. You can perhaps have some sex slaves, perhaps get a wife or whatever. And that has a huge amount of pull to an awful lot of people who either have a sense of meaningless, or that are angry, or that are sad. And while the end radical, overwhelmingly, the root is utterly banal and affects huge tranches of our society.
Does it affect huge tranches? There are 2.8 million Muslims in Britain, 5 million in France, there are 4 million in Germany. The number actually going to Syria is really pretty diminutive compared to the size of these communities.
But not compared to the amount of Muslims in the British Army, so I don't think you can exclude it. I mean, more young British Muslims go and join ISIS to join the British Army. So I don't think you can discard
but that's still
the figures.
pretty small.
But it signifies something quite important in our society, that more men and women are going off to join ISIS from our Muslim population than are joining.
Well, maybe they say something about the British Army, but actually it doesn't work, Anthony. The question is, there's an enormous Muslim community here of 2.8 million people. Very
Perhaps
few
I
go
shouldn't
there.
have narrowed it to Britain, but if I'm talking about 22,000 foreign fighters that are part of ISIS, which is the figure now being discussed, that's not fighters, local fighters, it's foreign fighters. They've obviously got, you're quite right, quite a big thrall and attraction to people living in other countries, and that is part of the attraction I've described.
There's some really interesting work being done on ISIS messaging campaign and also the chains of recruitment. So as they start taking territory in and around Raqqa, the message goes out, and especially after Mosul, come and join the 5-star jihad. Come and be part of making history, of building the caliphate. And then when you get down anthropologically and see who these people are, especially the girls in Tower Hamlets, that one person is radicalized on the network and then spreads that amongst a very small and tightly knit group. And so you see, I think it's in the Netherlands, a core of young men on a street. So one goes, and then through social messaging says, oh no, but you promised to come with me. I'm here now, you come. So you have these chains of movement. So I think we're caught between two arguments here, both of which aren't wrong. It is a very small demographic, usually of disaffected, socially alienated and unemployed men, urban men. But they are more liable to this messaging the more peripheral they are within urban Western societies. And if you look, I wrote a paper on Daesh's jurisprudence, its religious capacity. Now, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi claims to have a PhD from Baghdad Islamic University that says more about the decline in the Iraqi higher education system than it does say about al-Baghdadi, because the actual religious content of their Salafism, which is a very, very fringe, austere reading of Islam, is negligible. It's not about religion. It's about meaning and violence. And of course, what are the demographics of people who join the army? Same, single men from 18 to their mid-20s who are looking for meaning in life and sex and adventure. And that's the small demographic within a much larger Muslim community across Western Europe will have nothing quite rightly to do with this aberration, this philosophically light aberration within their own religion.
I mean, we're probably going to have to wind it up, but there is obviously a bigger debate about this government's response to that and what actually that might do in the future to that community. But I think for now we're going to take one more question, I'm told. One more question. I can't wind up.
Thank you all so much for your talk. I had a question about the level of central command within IS. Are their operations largely decentralized, and I'm speaking about military operations, and is their operational capacity vulnerable to the death of key leaders?
I get the impression not. They seem to be able to replace, a good organization, military or political, can replace leaders. They see that in advance. And can you move other people in to take over? And generally they have. Is it decentralized? I think to a degree, but I think overall strategic planning is central. You can see that the way recent punches up and down the front line, I think diversionary to keep the Kurds and the others spread, and then finally, bang, they go for Ramadi or they go for Palmyra. All these things seem to be very carefully worked out. And as I said, they do command bigger and bigger forces. You join Islamic fighters. I tried one, well, through somebody else, I was in touch with one fighter who'd left, and quite lengthy training process, both in Fallujah he came from and Raqqa. They get about $350, $400 a month. They get free fuel, free food, stuff like that. There are no other jobs there. We're talking about alienation of people back here, but you really want to build large fighting forces. You have this area, probably about 6 million. The area of the Islamic State is about slightly bigger than Great Britain. About 6 million people. You can raise an awful lot of troops in there when there's nothing else to do for young men, for anybody. There are no jobs. So actually joining their fighting forces is maybe the best thing around.
Anthony?
I think that's a pretty good answer. Yeah, I don't think killing their commanders has a huge and immediate impact at all. Command seems quite devolved. They're pretty smart, and if you care to read the papers of one of their founders, there's an Iraqi Ba'athist intelligence officer called Colonel Haji Bakr. The actual level of intelligence use they make when taking over a community or an area is fascinating. It's very, very detailed. It's beyond Orwellian. The amount of effort and energy they put into destructuring a community as they take it over and then restructuring it. So a pretty smart organisation.
Toby?
Yeah, as was being said, the vast majority of their senior command came from the mid-ranks of the Ba'athist Iraqi military and intelligence services. As that collapsed in 2003, that skill set was scattered and then reconstituted around the Iraqi Civil War, 2004-06. Then Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia formed round a lot of veterans from the US prison system who'd been lifted in these mass sweeps, 2003, 2006, sent through Camp Cropper, Camp Bucca, these kept big holding facilities in Iraq, and then came out. The central core is quite tight, and then it's decentralized down into emirs that control regions. Enter the drones after August, which then kills quite effectively mid to senior rank individuals. They've replenished from a much larger stock of these skilled mid-ranking Iraqi military and intelligence figures, and they keep going. So I don't think, and keep in mind that very key corps survived the US-led surge, and so their operational security, their ability to function under this intense air campaign has been proven for 4 years after the start of the surge.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just to pick up on that, the idea that they come out some out of the old Iraqi Army and the officer corps always seems to me very exaggerated, because my experience of the Iraqi Army in war was they generally ran like rabbits. In 1991, they didn't do very well against the Iranians. 2003, the same thing, fighting the Peshmerga in 91. Generally disaster. Why are they effective? Well, it's the last point you make. They have it's like Hezbollah. They have military experience. You've been fighting the Americans, the Iraqi Army for 10 years, and you're still in business. You're probably pretty good at your job.
I would just make one point on the end of that. You see in the film the scene with the water tower, and I point to that because of their ability to control media. There's, the enemies that they're fighting can't put out the things they can and in the way that they can to the media. So their ability to recruit and to build fear around a particular campaign is massive, and I think that has a lot of effect on people on the ground. All the Peshmerga soldiers at the time were looking at the video of the Lebanese pilot being burnt alive, and that ability to directly drop that in, even if you lose some senior command and you need to rebuild after an offensive, is a very powerful tool, and people are controlled by that, I think, today, as we see in social media and phones. So. Sorry.
Well, I believe we are out of time, so we'll have to wrap up now. But thank you so much to everyone on the panel for being here tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. For those who wanted to come tonight but couldn't get tickets,